This is California Convictions. My name is Aaron Channel, and I served a grip of time in the California Department of Corrections. I speak occasionally about my experiences while I was incarcerated here in this forum on YouTube. I wanted to speak about observing the Passover Seder in prison. I was not a seriously observant Jewish inmate. There were guys there who really had suffered for their faith. There were men who said, I'd rather go hungry than break kosher. I never had that kind of commitment to it. If we're being frank, if the food hadn't been better on the kosher meals, I don't expect that I would have observed the services. That said, I did have the unique experience of sitting down at a Passover Seder year after year with many men for whom it was one of the most important nights of the year, a night of holy observance and remembrance of the things their people had went through in their religion. And then there were another 15 or 20 guys there for whom it was just a chance to get some free food beyond the kosher program. The Passover Seder is an interesting experience for anybody who hasn't done something similar. There are a number of religions which observe a very similar process. The Catholics, the Jehovah's Witnesses, just about every Protestant faith in one fashion or another has a evolution of what the Jews observe. It's all very similar. These faiths have similar observances. That said, the manner in which the Jews remember the Passover is very different because they are not remembering Easter. They're not remembering the things that modern Christians think of. They are remembering the original Exodus from Egypt. Generally, the rabbi would give a short, and I do mean short, as in 2, 3, maybe 4-minute exhortation, sermon, whatever you wanted to call it, about, this is why we observe these traditions, this is what we do. Howdy Vegas Prison Stories, and howdy Arthur D. After he gave his speech, he would break out a couple of traditional things. There are a number of things that Jews do to observe the Passover. They take horseradish, for instance, and you might taste a little bit of it, and he'll say, well, this is to remind us of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. Anybody interested in the specific and exact rituals of the Seder, I'm not going to go into it in any depth. What I wanted to speak about was the experience of being a convict. They're in a prison chow hall with 15 or 20 other guys who are trying to observe their faith to whatever degree it's important to them. And you'd have the 15 or 20% who are really sincere. And Judaism is an observant religion, by which I mean that if you really want to spend all day being observant of the things in Judaism, you can. You always wear your yarmulke or your kippah. You always wear this garment under your shirt. You always wear this thing that way. You say 15 different prayers before you leave your room in the morning and 20 more before you go to bed at night. I'm being slightly hyperbolic. But my point is that it is a faith in which somebody can walk all day long and really obviously be trying to be observant of their faith. And you would have 4 or 5 guys in the chow hall that they were that sincere about it. They had the hair, and they had all of the garments that they'd paid for, and at least to outward appearances, they really observed all of the rituals. I happened to live with an observant Jew, and at least for this one gentleman that I lived with, I can tell you he was sincere about it. If he didn't remember to leave his TV on Thursday night, he wouldn't watch TV on Friday. He'd always cover it up with a towel because the rule was he couldn't turn his TV on or off or change the channel, but if it happened to be on, he could watch it. I'm not sure as to the exact rules or why it's important to do one thing or another. I'm just expressing that there's no doubt in my mind that this dude suffered for his faith, that he was sincere in it. And I was in the middle. While I didn't happen to share the exact beliefs that everybody else did, I did everything I could to be respectful, courteous in what was supposed to be a somber environment. Most everybody was. Out of the 20 or so people you'd have in the chow hall, again, you'd have the 5 observant Jews. And then you'd have another 12 or 13 guys like me who they were there And they didn't have the curly cues. You wouldn't see them wearing their yarmulkes day to day, but they did show up to the services. And then you'd have 3 or 4 more who happened to be on the list or for whatever reason, and who had no interest in being respectful of everybody else's area. Wouldn't have bothered me much, wouldn't have bothered the 12 guys who were just there to get a free meal, honestly, much. But I always had a lot of sympathy for the 5 guys who were really sincerely trying to be observant, trying to observe the religion that they'd grown up with, that their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents for more generations than I can wrap my head around had done pretty much the exact same thing on an annual basis. The right of an individual to observe their religious preferences while in prison is a little contentious. There was a sergeant that I knew, and I was on good terms with her, Sergeant Armour, and she was very politic in what she said, but it was very clear what she meant whenever she escorted us to the chow hall one time, and she said, you know, if I had my way, we wouldn't be doing any of these special meals for religious people. A lot of guys inferred that she had a problem with them specifically. I knew what she actually meant. It's that a lot of correctional officers feel that the extra privileges afforded inmates, the religious this, the art program that, well, the more privileges you give inmates, the more they abuse them, the more they find ways to take advantage of that. And it makes prison a less terrible place. I'm not saying that prison as a terrible place will have more rehabilitative value than one without it, but they would, and that was Sergeant Armour's opinion. She told me one time in confidence, if I had my way, we'd put you guys all back in chains, and you could dig a ditch in the field for 14 hours a day, and then we'd see what recidivism was like. I can't tell you one way or the other. But it was interesting in this chow hall, enjoying this privilege, and I did always think of it in that way, that wow, isn't it wonderful that we're all able to sit here and have this ceremony, which is brutally important to the 5 guys and nominally important to 12 of us, and then there's the 4 guys in the corner talking about a football game or playing cards or something and being relatively discourteous to everybody else. Because that's what you're going to have whenever you have a group of inmates, 20 inmates that volunteer for anything, is you're going to have a couple of guys that are real important to, a bunch more than it's maybe a little bit important to, and the couple guys over in the corner who, well, it's just a chance to get out of the cell. SC Community says, he says, good Pesach, and thanks, an awesome thing to tune in on. Well, I'm just very happy to be able to talk about it, honestly. He says that he hopes my family and myself had a good evening, regardless of whether or not I'm observant. My wife, about whom I don't speak at any great length on this channel because it's always awkward to talk about somebody else. You want to speak about them and really be honest about how decent and wonderful and good they are. She is a rabbi. She is observant and practicing, and she puts a lot of effort into her day-to-day life to be a decent and wonderful person. I am less observant, and my children have not yet reached the age of reason where it's important to them one way or the other, I believe. Thank you so much. The interesting thing about observing the Passover Seder in prison, as somebody who wasn't super observant, but I always did try to be respectful of the environment, was that the guy who did the ceremonies, and we called him the para-rabbi, that was the term they gave him. He was not a rabbi. He had no rabbinate. He had no formal Jewish education outside of having said, you know, I'm willing to go to the prison, have a background check done, and then go and watch these guys while they do their Seder. It's called a brown card. And anybody who is a member of a faith and wants to go to a prison in California and jump through all the hoops, and there are quite a few of them, I'm sure they do a background check, you can't be a felon or anything like it. But it's not that hard for a lot of faiths to volunteer to show up at the prison and do a decent thing and just oversee a service. The guards figure that they don't need an armed guard there making sure everything goes right. All they need is somebody trained to make sure the inmates aren't taking the opportunity to go dig a tunnel in the back or shoot up drugs in the bathroom or whatever dumb things it is that inmates will do if you afford them the privilege of doing so. The gentleman who came and saw We'll call him Ariel Sharon. That was the name of the prime minister. And I don't want to use his actual name, the para-rabbi who came and saw us. It seems impolite to violate his privacy in that manner. For all I know, he wouldn't want it talked about. He seemed like a decent man. He would show up once a week. And he was paid, but I don't think it was much. He was not retiring on the wage that the prison was giving him. To show up at the prison for 2 hours at a time, once or twice a week, and then occasionally oversee a service. I spoke to him on occasion, and it seemed like he did it out of a zeal for his faith. He did it because he didn't like the idea of anybody in the world being unable to observe the rituals that were important to him, because he was an observant Jew. And so he would drive I think he said it was 2 hours or something like that, to the prison once a week, and he would oversee services for the Jews and one other faith. He would sit in on the Muslims' faith occasionally because they were having a hard time finding an imam at that particular time, which is a lovely thing if you think about it. And I would note that there were also occasions upon which we had an imam oversee the Jewish services in prisons that I was at. This is just because there are a limited number of people who are able to oversee a service, and the services that have a smaller number of inmates often need to band together and try and help each other out. The Protestants, generally, and not always, there were places where the Protestants had a very hard time getting the rights that were afforded to them, but generally they always had as much chapel time as they needed because they had plenty of local volunteers that were willing to come in and help. These smaller faiths, the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Jews, the Messianic Jews, and in some places, the Islamic inmates, they had a harder time getting chapel time, getting this and that. It was always nice to be able to sit in at a Passover Seder. One of the special things was that they would give the inmates grape juice. And grape juice over the course of the Passover week, because we'd always get a special meal. You're supposed to be more observant during this time. It was a free-for-all. Again, you had the couple of guys who tried to be observant and who really, it was important to them to be able to observe the rituals and have grape juice whenever they wanted it. And then you had the other guys who had worked their way onto the system in whatever way. And you know what you can use grape juice to do? You can make wine with it. Duh. And so it was always a big toss-up whether the guys were going to save up all of their grape juice and try and make a batch of wine with sugar, or whether they're just going to enjoy the fact that they had a little juice box once a day of Welch's grape juice, which was so exciting because that's the only time of the year you're going to get something like that. They also give matzah crackers for a week to anybody who wants them, which is really cool. They have very little nutritive value. You've heard unleavened bread, or if that doesn't resonate, you can go ahead and try just saltines, except way crunchier and way drier. Yes, I do mean drier than saltines. They're not bad, actually. They were a commodity during the Passover week, not just amongst the Jewish inmates, but because so many were given out, that there was a trickle-down effect. They'd give every Jewish inmate just that much matzah bread. You can only eat so much of this stuff, so they tended to distribute it down the line to people who asked for it. You'd see guys walking around with big matzah sandwiches who had no conception of the Jewish faith or the relevance of the Passover. Pedro Miguel says, thanks for being here, Aaron, and similarly, thanks for tuning in. I just found myself thinking about all of the Passovers that I sat in a kitchen or a chow hall or heck a cell with another Jewish inmate or a group of Jewish inmates. And there's something that they say in every Seder. They say, this year we are slaves. Next year we'll be free. This year we are slaves. Next year we'll be free. And I think that it resonated deeply with all of the men in prison. And these are the guys who actually knew they would be getting out next year and who were thinking about their new lives. And the guys who, well, they knew they were never going to get out. But you can still think about that next year in a hypothetical and wonderful sense. Hope springs eternal, they say. I don't know if I ever met a man who truly quit hoping that next year was going to be the year. I found myself thinking about that this evening as I was buying the provisions to cook a nice meal for my family, and it occurred to me that it would be the decent thing to do to try and tell their story if I could, because I happen to have an audience that's willing to listen to me. Again, those 20 men in the chow hall. There's 12 or 13, like myself, who frankly, if the food wasn't better, if they hadn't been just bored in the cell and looking for something to do or whatever their justification was, they wouldn't have shown up. You got the 5 guys in the corner who they really don't care at all. They go to all the things and they're a little rude about it. But okay, it's prison. No one's going to tell them they can't. If you want to take advantage of the system, well, just try and be polite about it, basically. No inmate is going to be a cop on another inmate and say, hey, man, you can't be here. Or at least if they do, it's not going to be a fun conversation. And then you had those 5 men off to the side who would spend 15 minutes making sure that everything was perfect, that there was nothing that was going to screw up their meal. They'd scrub the table. They'd lay out a little sheet that one of them had very carefully prepared. They'd go to the corner and they'd wash their hands all the way, saying prayers. And I couldn't help but respect that. It reminded me of the root of prison. You know, they used to call them penitentiaries. That's penitent is where that word comes from, like doing penance. The idea used to be that you just got yourself a prison and you found a guy and he'd done something awful, but you didn't want to execute him. You wanted to give him a chance to turn towards God, because that was the idea at the time, that evilness, awfulness, monstrousness, criminality, crime, these things came from a lack of Christian faith. And so they built these prisons and put men in them. They called them penitentiaries, and they called these men penitents, and they gave them a Bible, and they put them in a cell and told them, we'll see you in 6 months. Here's your bucket of food and water to eat now, and whenever your bucket's full in the other direction, we'll trade it out with another bucket of food and water. Maybe they worked him half to death all day long and then put him back in the cell at night. Maybe not. These weren't kind prisons 150 years ago. Anybody who complains about conditions today hasn't read on how things used to be. But the logic was that if you just gave a man enough time where the only thing he had to do was penance, to turn towards God and read that Bible in whatever context it might mean to them, well, they would change. They would become better men and rehabilitate themselves. I don't know that it worked that way. I think those were probably awful places that ruined people as often as helped them. But whenever I look over at those couple of guys in the corner really sincerely following through on every aspect of their faith, their observance that they could, well, I for one was grateful that that kind of privilege is afforded to inmates, that 25% of guys who took advantage of the Seder, that they had a not rabbi, a volunteer who was willing to show up, and that they had other guys who were willing to pad the roster and get at least the 10 inmates who are going to show up. Because if you don't have 10 guys that'll show up consistently, the state won't pay for that not rabbi to be there. You need at least 10 interested members of your faith on a yard. It's a strange idea that affording privileges to inmates, or rights if you prefer, because the court has decided that the observance of basic religious practices, like the Passover, or like Easter, or like confession for the Catholics, observing the 5 pillars, well, I suppose 4, you're going to have a hard time convincing the prison to let you take the Hajj, but observing the 4 pillars of Islam for the Muslims, that these are not privileges, that they are a basic right. And it's afforded under our LUPA, the Religious Land Use and Practices Act. And they went all the way up to the Supreme Court and was confirmed that this is something that human beings in California in prison, in the United States in prison, have a basic human right to, or else it's cruel and unusual punishment because it's formative to their faiths, on the condition that they are sincere in their beliefs. And that is a very difficult metric to measure. Still, if we have to choose between prisons that afford this to inmates, whether it's a right or a privilege, or ones that don't, ones that just put you on that chain gang 4 hours a day and then let you sleep for 4 and then put you on a different chain gang for 14 more, well, Sergeant Armour thought that the chain gang was the way to go, and I can't think that it was, because yes, maybe those 5 guys over in the corner playing cards and joking and ruining everybody else's time, God, maybe they could use some time on that chain gang. I'm not saying that I didn't do time with men who what they really needed was to learn the value of a hard day's work. But I don't think that that's what those other 5 guys who are praying and fasting and washing their hands and sincerely trying to observe every aspect of their faith out of love and sincerity. I can't imagine that taking that away from them in any context makes them better people, makes society safer, makes the world a better place. It's just my opinion. But I did a grip of time with these men. It is an expert's opinion. I'm going to look at the comments for just a moment. Diego Scalic says, "What's up, man?" And SC Community says, "It sounds like a Passover dinner Goodfellas style." He says, "I have thought you're going to talk about a time you guys mashed the potatoes and made latkes with a stinger." There are some gentlemen who go way all out with whatever cuisine they happen to have grown up with. I had Selly, who was an immigrant from Mexico and who had grown up on ranch. And he made the best stinking tamales that I've had my entire life. They're in prison with a George Foreman grill that somebody had stolen out of a back break room. And then he had broken it down and remade it up so that it looked like a typewriter, except you could mash it down. It was a George Foreman grill on the inside. It just looked like a typewriter because he'd taken the guts from a typewriter out. And he made that, and I talked to him. He said, "Well, it's pretty dang close to the recipe I grew up with. I just had to use tortilla chips instead of this and this instead of that, but I did everything I could to make it taste the same." Similar to their Jewish inmates who really tried to come up with some version of traditional Jewish foods. I had a gentleman who was a deaf toasty, and he'd cook a bunch of interesting meals. And I had a Selly, Brandon, who he wanted to be a good cook, but unfortunately I don't think that he had the palate for, in whatever way, he thought things should be much saltier than anybody else thought they should be. Well, I wanted to spend a little bit of time speaking about the Passover Seder in prison because I'd found myself thinking about the guys I did time with earlier. I think I'm going to close this live stream now. But I wanted to sincerely thank anybody who took the time to show up today and listen to what I had to say about it. I hope it was informational, educational, maybe even edifying. Thank you so much for listening. Good night.